Hello everyone, Inquisitor Vaughn here, and today I decided to do a deep dive video into the chapter lore of the Executioner's chapter. They're one of my favorite Space Marine chapters because I play Warhammer 30k. In Warhammer 30k I play Imperial Fists, and recently Games Workshop released the miniature for Fafnir Rann for 30k setting on the tabletop, and I also play Executioners in the Badab War setting. I could technically use that army in 40k as well, so I'm a huge fan of them. They are a Son of Dorn chapter, and they've gotten a lot of attention lately because of the release of Fafnir Rann. And so I decided to do a deep dive video into their lore, and I myself found things that I found to be interesting and I didn't know before, or I didn't notice before. So I'm hoping that this video is informative to anyone who would like to know more about the chapter. Now, this video is based on someone having a very basic knowledge of who the Executioners are, but also it will contain spoilers to the books Saturnine and Praetorian of Dorn and Warhawk from the Horus Heresy series. So if you haven't read those books, I would suggest you clicking out of the video because I don't want to ruin those books for you. But if you are open to knowing this knowledge without reading the books, then by all means continue forward. Let's get into it. If we're going to try to understand the Executioners, we're going to have to understand the figure that would lead them, their chapter master, and that chapter master is Fafnir Rann. Fafnir Rann is a legendary figure in the Horus Heresy narrative in the Imperial Fist Legion, and he is well known now because Games Workshop recently released a miniature of him with a horrible head sculpt, but that's another subject for another video. But they released a miniature of him, and he's gotten the attention that he deserves for the role he plays in the Horus Heresy. However, his role extends into the 40k millennium because he survives the Horus Heresy and he would later lead the Executioners. So I wanted to go over a little bit of his history, his personality, to better give an understanding of who led the Executioners and who shaped them into the chapter that they would eventually be. Fafnir Rann's story begins on Inwit, an ice world that is well known throughout the Imperium for being the place where Rogal Dorn is raised and becomes the 7th Primarch. However, we're talking about Fafnir here. So Fafnir, his story began as a baby. His mother, who was originally of the House of Dorn, or the tribe of Dorn, fled the House of Dorn for unknown reasons, taking him with her as a baby. Now, she was successful in fleeing, but she was stabbed in the process, and so she later died because of that stab wound and starvation. Now, the baby Fafnir was found by another tribe called the Rann. Now, these people, they took Fafnir in, they raised him, and he became Fafnir Rann. Now, ever since he was taken into that tribe, he was taught that he would be the one to lead the Rann against the Dorn. So apparently there was some tribal beef going on. And so when he became an adult, they actually chose him to be the chief of the Rann tribe. And one of the first things that he did was declare war on the Dorn tribe. But soon after he declared war on the Dorn, things started to change on Inwit with the arrival of the 7th Primarch, who would later be found by the Dorn tribe and called Rogal Dorn. Now, Rogal Dorn would become the 7th Primarch and would lead the Imperial Fists. So things began to change soon after that war was initiated. Anyone who knows anything about Rogal Dorn could tell that Fafnir Rann and Rogal Dorn were completely different, and I'm thinking it's because of the tribes that raised them. And I find it interesting that both have the last name of the tribes that found them. It's also entertaining to think about how close it was that Rogal Dorn could have been adopted by another tribe, and to think about whether or not he would be different than what he is now, because the Emperor is responsible for the inner nature of the Primarchs, right? So the aspect of war that they embody, but the expression of that is flavored and shaped by the culture and the people who raised the Primarchs. And so when we look at the difference in personality between Rogal Dorn and Fafnir Rann, I think it's kind of interesting to see, like, and to think about, what if Rogal Dorn was found by the Rann? Considering the kind of person that Fafnir Rann would eventually become, would he have been different in some way? And would the Imperial Fists Legion have been shaped differently? We don't know, but I think it's interesting to think about that kind of thing. Kind of like another sidebar that I want to go into is that the majority of the Primarchs matured at a much faster rate than regular humans. For most of them, they were not infants when they were found in their gestation pods, but children. It is unknown how long it would take for Rogal Dorn to master the inward cluster, but knowing what we do about the process of becoming an Astartes and going off of like the basic understanding that most tribal cultures often lack a phase that we know as the teenage years, Fafnir Rann was most likely in his teenage years when he became chief of the Rann tribe. Though primitive at the time, the process of turning a human into an Astartes still required them to be within a certain age range for it to be successful. Fafnir Rann would eventually be inducted into the Imperial Fists without complications, which means he was still around the age necessary to become an Astartes, the process of which usually finishes around 18 to 20 years of age. What I'm getting at with all of this is that before Dorn was visited by the Emperor, before he mastered the Inwit cluster, during the early years of his life in the House of Dorn, amidst the tribal war between the Rann tribe and the Dorn tribe, at one point in time, Rogal Dorn and Fafnir Rann possibly stood across each other at the battlefield. And I think that's an interesting thought as well, considering the future of the two. As said before, Fafnir Rann was inducted into the Imperial Fist Legion under the Primarch Rogal Dorn and was such an exceptional warrior that by the opening days of the Horus Heresy, he had become a centurion of the Legion, which is known as a Lord Seneschal in the 7th Legion, and was commander of the Legion's first assault cadre, having long favored close combat over ranged warfare. Now, there are certain words used to describe Fafnir, including brutal and ruthless, and this is often accompanied by the fact that he carries 2 huge axes and a boarding shield. But it wasn't just these weapons that made him brutal, it was how he used them combined with his mentality and perspective. Fafnir's sense of honor was flavored by a justification for cruelty, indifference, and mercilessness toward his enemies, and this is illustrated perfectly in a scene from the book Saturnine, in which Fafnir faces off against the Iron Warriors. One of the Iron Warriors he is facing falls due to debris falling on the battlefield or something of that nature. Fafnir Rann makes his way over to the Iron Warrior, he helps him to his feet, and then chops him in the spine with his power axe. Fafnir's reasoning for this was, in fair war, you do not put a man down like a dog. When he has fallen, you let him stand no matter what kind of man he has become. Now, while this sounds reasonable and noble, putting an axe through the warrior's spine likely paralyzed him before it killed him. It was not a swift death, and it's not likely that anyone who died by Rann's axes had a swift death unless he chose it, which he rarely did. Because he was the commander of the first assault company of the Imperial Fists, Fafnir Rann often fought alongside Sigismund, the first captain of the Imperial Fist and commander of the Templar Brethren. It is through this association that we understand more about Fafnir's personality and contrast to Sigismund. While both Astartes were masters at close combat and both were noble in spirit, Sigismund was more of a knight. When he fought, he dueled. Combat for Sigismund was an illustration of skill, deadly grace, and control. Fafnir was the opposite. Fafnir was a butcher. When he fought, he slaughtered. Combat for Fafnir Rann was a blatant theater of dominance. To further elaborate upon this, I refer to a scene from the Horus Heresy series in the Praetorian of Dorn, in which Fafnir and Sigismund are fighting beside each other during the Siege of Terra. Rann notices that Sigismund is tired and they engage in conversation. In that conversation, Rann basically says, "You don't belong here." The exact words were, "This is not the work for the likes of you. For a dog like me, perhaps, hacking through corridors and feeling the rounds ring on plate, that's my life, but not yours. You should be at the Primarch's side. You should speak to him. Your presence out here is not the optimal use of resources. Hacking through madmen and chasing down rogue ships? Indulge my candor, but that's work for an axe, not a sword." Fafnir Rann was brutal. He was ruthless, he was direct, competent, aggressive, but most of all, he was loyal. During the Siege of Terra, he fought on the front lines along with many other legendary loyalists of the era, taking his count of traitor marines. Rogal Dorn was the Emperor's crusader, and Sigismund was the Emperor's champion. And while the Emperor's executioner is a title given to Leman Russ, rightfully so, Fafnir Rann wasn't the Emperor's executioner. He was Dorn's executioner, and he was valued for that. Rogal Dorn valued Rand's expertise and style of war. Through his own merit, Fafnir Rann rose through the ranks of the Legion, earning various titles of leadership and fighting in key battles during the Horus Heresy. It is no wonder that he would eventually be granted the title of Chapter Master over his own chapter of Space Marines after the Horus Heresy. This chapter would be called the Executioners. After the Horus Heresy, the legions were split into chapters to ensure that something like the Horus Heresy would not occur again. Rogal Dorn was strongly against this, and it almost led to another civil war, but finally Dorn relented, and during the second founding, the Imperial Fist's legion was divided. Now, there's some debate about how many chapters were actually created from the 7th Legion during the second founding, but I think generally the more chapters created, the more accurate, as prior to the second founding, the Imperial Fist still had legion-sized numbers. Available information lists that the Imperial Fist chapter, the Black Templars, the Crimson Fist, the Excoriators, the Fist Exemplar, and the Soul Drinkers were all created during the second founding, which means that at the end of the Horus Heresy, the Imperial Fist numbered around 6,000 Marines, which sounds accurate to me. The third founding of Space Marines occurred in 001 M32 and was brought forth by the Primarch Rogal Dorn. It was in this founding that the Executioners chapter was created. Little is known about the actions of Fafnir Rann after the Horus Heresy. However, it is known that he served in the Imperial Fist chapter led by Rogal Dorn himself until the third founding. Due to his rank in the Legion, I can't imagine Fafnir Rann being anything other than a captain of the Imperial Fist chapter during that time, most likely the captain of the chapter's 8th company, the Assault Company, the official title of which is the chapter's Lord Executioner. During the third founding, 2 chapters were to be direct successors of the Imperial Fist chapter, and one would be given to Fafnir Rann to lead. This chapter was to be called the Executioners by Rogal Dorn. Their responsibility was to seek out and slaughter mankind's enemies instead of taking a defensive stance. Fafnir Rann was to be the chapter's Patriarch, its chapter master, and its first high executioner. However, it was likely that he was not alone in this endeavor, taking with him some of the Imperial Fist veterans who served with him, who would later become the first warlords of the Executioners chapter. The heraldry of the Executioners would be the twin axes on a shield of red, an ancient symbol of the Imperial Fist Legion that came to be associated with Fafnir Rann's company, the First Assault Company. It also was a battle honor for a triumph in Zone Mortalis or Fatal Ground missions, which were some of the most horrific arenas of war at the time. With Geneseed from the Imperial Fists, Fafnir Rann as a chapter master, veterans of the Fists as warlords, a chapter name, and a chapter heraldry, all that was left was a population of peoples to recruit from. This came in the form of the population from the binary world of Stygia Aquilon, but not at first. According to available information, the Executioners chapter was founded in M32. However, their homeworld of Stygia Aquilon is said to have been theirs since the closing years of M37. Warhammer lore often conflicts, and one of the things I like to do is piecing together the lore and adding reasonable fluff in gray areas that can somehow make the lore make sense. In this case of the Executioners, we're going to have to add some fluff and speculation based on what information we are given. The Executioners chapter needed time to form after its founding, meaning candidates for the chapter had to be collected and put through trial. Now, where did these initiates come from if the Executioners only claimed Stygia Aquilon in M37? My guess is the Imperial Fist recruits. The Imperial Fist recruited from many worlds in the Imperium of Man, and while there is a limit to how many Space Marines can be in a chapter, there is no limit to how many recruits or initiates a chapter could have. So it's my guess that they just took from the pool of Imperial Fist recruits. The modern lore lists that there are a few tithing worlds which regularly give recruits to the Imperial Fists, including Terra, the Jovian Moons, Inuit, Pharos, Necromunda, and a few dozen more worlds. It's likely that the early executioners were recruited from these worlds. Okay, great. So a couple of hundred years after the founding and the chapter is at full strength, what happened after that? If we track the history of the recorded battles fought by the executioners, we can determine that they spent time in the Segmentum Solar before moving south. The first recorded battles of the Executioner was the invasion of Nova Sulis in M36. While we aren't given an exact location to the hive world of Nova Sulis, it can be determined to have been either on the edges of the Segmentum Solar or the edges of the Segmentum Tempestus south of the Segmentum Solar. The campaign against the heretic forces was a success, and they fought alongside the Space Wolves, the Angels of Absolution, and the Raven Guard at various points during this battle. The invasion of Nova Sulis was a ferocious slaughter of anyone who took arms against the executioners. For their accomplishment, the executioners were gifted the right of having a successor chapter made from their gene seed in a later founding. From here, the chapter's battles trail them moving further south from the Segmentum Solar into the Segmentum Tempestus. According to lore, they claimed the binary world of Stygia Aquilon as their homeworld in M37. 2,000 years later, the Executioner's chapter fortress monastery called Darkenvault was sieged by an unknown Xenos, and the chapter was brought down to nearly 300 Marines before being aided by the Astral Claws chapter and Battlefleet Tempestus. The Executioners participated in many other battles between M39 and M41, including the hunt for Hector Revoken, the Battle of Carrion Deep, and finally the Badab War, before they would have to go on a penitent crusade for siding with the secessionists during the Badab War. There are a few points in the Executioner's chapter history that, from the lore, I would like to point out. First, that the Executioner's chapter was a fleet-based chapter for most of its early history before they claimed Stygia Aquilon as their homeworld. Secondly, there is no record of when or how Fafnir Rann died. It's only clear that he died before M39 because a different High Executioner was stated as the chapter master during this time. So why is this? Usually when a chapter master dies, it's something noted in the chapter history, but this is not so with Fafnir Rann. I make a lot of speculations in this video, but this is something that I honestly don't want to speculate on. It's just hard to believe that such a mighty Astartes death was so nonchalantly unrecorded. However, for the sake of this video, I will share 4 theories that I have ranging from the most likely to the least likely as to why his death was unrecorded or how he died or the circumstances around his death. My first reason that I have on this list, and the most likely, is GW's laziness. I know I'm kind of breaking the fourth wall here, but if we have zero information on what happened to him after the founding of the Executioners, the first place to blame is GW for lack of lore in that department. Now, the second reason that I have is he could have died during the early campaigns of the chapter. The Executioners were founded in M32, but their first recorded battle was in M36. We don't know what happened in the 4,000 years between those two periods, and we don't even know who led the Executioners in the invasion of Nova Sulis. Fafnir Rann could have very well died in one of the early chapter campaigns, which were unrecorded, and could explain why his death went unrecorded as well. Perhaps it's due to the largely unrecorded nature of the Executioner's chapter early history that the current chapter has so many death speakers, who are the equivalent of chaplains, whose responsibility in part is maintaining precise records of the chapter's battles. A third reason, which is less likely, is that he was killed by the traditions of the Executioner's chapter. Now, warlords in the Executioner's chapter can challenge each other if they are not deemed worthy to lead. Fafnir could have been overthrown by his own men, challenged in close combat, and losing. This could explain why his death was not recorded as a way of honoring him. This is only a speculation, but there is no records of any challenges to any High Executioners having ever took place in the chapter, even though this is a firmly stated piece of their lore. And this begs the question, if it did happen, would they even record it? There are definitely more than 3 chapter masters of the Executioners in the 8,000 years that they have existed. And so now I'm a little bit suspicious. But again, this reason is less likely than the ones before it. The last and least likely explanation as to this is he didn't die and he's still alive. This is the least likely because it's been thousands of years since he became an Astartes, so I think it's safe to say that he died, but for some reason it's unrecorded. Regardless of what happened to Fafnir Rann, his legacy as an astounding Space Marine commander lives on through the Executioner's chapter, which still fights on in the current lore. Alright, so I mentioned Stygia Aquilon earlier. And Stygia Aquilon served as the Executioner's chapter homeworld beginning in M37. It's located somewhere southwest of the Segmentum Solar between the Segmentum Tempestus and the Segmentum Pacificus. Though its exact location is kept a secret by the chapter, it's said to be stationed at the fringe, at the very boundary of the Imperium in that direction. Stygia Aquilon is described as a binary world whose planets are tidal locked to one another, and both worlds are described as worlds of fire and ice, circling an old red giant star. Not much information is given about the planet, and so I decided to do some research to help paint a better picture of the environment. 40k lore is not supposed to make any sense since it's all made up, however I just could not resist, and this is a deep dive, so endure or suffer. Alright, so tidal locking is when one celestial body has the same rotational period as its orbital period around another celestial body. A perfect example of this is the Earth and the Moon. The Moon is tidal locked to the Earth, meaning that the Moon rotates in exactly the same time it takes to orbit the Earth. This is why we only see one side of the Moon, because it's the side that's always facing the Earth despite its movement. Stygia and Aquilon are tidal locked to each other. If I think about it too much, I start to get a headache, but basically both planets are close enough to each other that their name is hyphenated and they're considered a binary world, and the same face is facing each other all the time. In between those two planets is a large asteroid which would later be turned into Darkenvault, the fortress monastery of the Executioner's chapter. So if you were to try to visualize Stygia Aquilon, just visualize two planets that are very close to each other, that don't turn, they don't rotate, and the same face is facing each other at all times, and in between these two very close planets is a large asteroid that was used as a fortress monastery for the Executioners. The environment on a tidal-locked world is extreme because one side is always facing the sun while the other side is always facing away from the sun. Now what this results in is one side being extremely hot and barren and the other side being extremely cold and frozen. Literally a planet of fire and ice, like the lore says. There is a possibility on a tidal-locked planet of having a thin iris-like space around the planet between the two extremes where life could exist, but it would do so in constant fluctuations between the different faces of the planet. There would be no change in season on a tidal-locked world, nor change in day. In the middle habitable zone on the surface of the planet, it would almost always be dusk. Also, because of the movement of air caused by the temperatures on both sides, it would be extremely windy, as in hurricane type wind. There would also be no change in season and no rising or setting of the sun. To avoid fluctuations in heat or cold caused by wind conditions and temperatures bleeding into this habitable zone, a human population on the world would have to constantly migrate back and forth from and towards either side of the planet in restless migrations from one place to the other, always. But this is the 40k universe, and so we can assume that some form of primitive technology existed on the world that enabled survival to be a little bit more manageable. But for the most part, Stygia Aquilon was a unique limbo kind of hell for humans who lived on it. The peoples on the world had to have been used to a hard life, always on the move and attentive of weather fluctuations, and physically limited to a ring on the surface around the planet on which they could survive. And because this is the 40k universe we're talking about, they likely warred with each other for one thing or another as well. Welcome to Stygia Aquilon. It is from this world that the Executioner's chapter began to recruit in M37 after declaring it their homeworld. It is here that I suggest that with the acquisition of Stygia Aquilon as their homeworld and the chapter began recruiting from the world's population, that a cultural shift began in the Executioner's chapter in which they became less imperial fist-like and more defined by the population of Stygia Aquilon. The chapter already had a fearsome reputation due to the teachings and traditions of Fafnir Rann, but I do think that there were certain elements that were influenced by them recruiting from this specific population. The executioners already had an affinity for close combat and the pursuing of enemies of mankind. That's what Fafnir Rann instilled in the chapter. However, there are certain elements of the chapter beliefs that seem to distinctly originate from the human population of Stygia Aquilon. For example, their spiritual beliefs, which according to the lore primarily take the form of animism and ancestor worship, as well as the belief in the god emperor, in which to me this represents the melding of two cultures, the Imperium and the culture of Stygia Aquilon. Another belief system that is sourced from the population on the world is that each individual battle brother is expected to forge his own path to glory and be worthy of remembrance. It's the death speakers who keep count of each battle brother's notable deeds and records of the chapter's battles. And the executioners had a higher than usual amount of chaplains or death speakers in comparison to other chapters, at least 3 per company, and were not given any information as to if this change was already there or if it happened after they started recruiting from the culture or from the people on Stygia Aquilon. The idea of honor is strong in the Executioner's chapter. Personal slights between battle brothers are solved through bloodshed. The chapter masters can be challenged to a trial of close combat if they are deemed unworthy to lead, and each warlord is literally a warlord, having control over their company with a degree of autonomy, with death speakers serving to keep them from fighting each other and coming to unnecessary blows. All of these things are hints at the culture of the peoples on Stygia Aquilon. Now, it's hard to tell specifically what traditions come from Fafnir Rann's teaching and what comes from the peoples of Stygia Aquilon beyond the spiritual beliefs, and this is likely because they were very similar. Similar environments in 40k tend to breed similar people. When looking at Fafnir Rann and the Executioners, it's common to compare them to other barbaric chapters such as the Space Wolves. The similarity between expressive elements, chapter traditions, temperament, and style of war are very obvious. But the source of these similarities, in my opinion, comes from the culture produced from the environments in which they were made. Both Inuit and Fenris were ice worlds whose peoples were tribal, tough, and durable. Fafnir's personality and style of war was likely influenced by the Rann tribe which raised him. Had he stayed as part of the House of Dorn, he would have been completely different. On Stygia Aquilon, when fluctuations in temperature happened, it was more likely that the tribal groups would go towards the colder side of the planet rather than the hotter side, as it would be easier to survive through technological means or underground systems. This belief in individual story and fulfillment of greatness was one that Fafnir Rann was raised with, a belief that all Fenrisians are raised with, and apparently one that Aquilans hold dear as well, which would express themselves in the chapter cult of both the Executioners and the Space Wolves. So in regards to the origin of some of the chapter beliefs that make the Executioners and the Space Wolves similar, in my opinion, the common denominator is that both human recruits lived on essentially cold worlds that produced a very Viking-like and Nordic-inspired style culture. It's the cultural themes that people are catching on to and seeing similarities between. Fafnir Rann instilled the ways and views of the Rann into the Executioners, and the culture of the human population of Stygia Aquilon complemented them as well as added on to them in a way that made the Executioners different from many other Imperial Fist successors. When their fortress monastery was attacked by an unknown Xeno species and the chapter was brought low and nearly annihilated, the Astroclaws chapter assisted them and saved them from ruin. The Executioners swore to come to the aid of the Astroclaws if they ever needed it because of this, and this is what led to the Executioners chapter participating in the Badab War. It was them essentially keeping their word that saw them on the wrong side of this conflict. However, when the Astroclaws began to attack a surrendering contingent of salamanders, the Executioners turned on the Astroclaws for it, seeing it as dishonorable. The Executioners are not a chapter that clings to a singular definition of unconditional loyalty. They keep their word but cannot stand dishonorable actions and will turn against allies if they deem an action to be dishonorable, unafraid of the consequences of doing so. And though it isn't talked about very much because it's so mysterious, the Corsair massacre that happened between the executioners and the Carcharodons, or the space sharks, in which it was a battle in which both sides defeated each other into mutual annihilation, that conflict likely had to do over a matter of honor. So the executioners take honor very seriously. As far as battle doctrine is concerned, it's well known that the executioners are brutal close combatants who prefer assault-style warfare whenever possible. However, this isn't to say that they didn't utilize firepower, only to say that the goal of every combat to them was close combat. The executioners lacked Devastator squads and replaced them with Sternguard veterans. Now, most people know this about the executioners, but there's one arena of war that the executioners excel in that is not emphasized in their lore enough for my liking, and that is Fatal Ground, or Zone Mortalis warfare. Fafnir Rann and his first assault company deployed frequently in Zone Mortalis missions during the Horus Heresy, where they were instrumental in shipboardings and shock assaults. The executioners followed in this tradition as well, whether during the invasion of Nova Sulis, which was a hive world, or the battle for Carrion Deep, in which they went close combat with Necrons, or the hunt for Hector Revoken, in which they boarded his ship, or even during the Badab War, during which the executioners acquired the most enemy ships out of all the successionists in the conflict. Close combat in dense fighting conditions was where the chapter excelled. Alright, so I want to go on a little tangent about the Nighthag. The Nighthag was a primary ship deployed by the executioners during the Badab War. It was said to be a cruiser of an unknown class that was originally the flagship of the renegade rogue trader Hector Revoken, before being seized by the executioners and cleansed of chaos energy by the Adeptus Mechanicus. Now, since I enjoy playing Battlefleet Gothic tabletop and I have a strong interest in 40k ships, I thought it would be cool to try to do a deep dive and try to figure out what kind of ship it actually was. According to available information, it was sufficiently armed to take on Loyalist Imperial Navy cruisers one-on-one, but agile enough to escape any trap set for it, which to me places it squarely in the category of Grand Cruiser class and not a battleship, but also not a light cruiser. It was also described as being swift and heavily armed with weapons batteries, lances, and fighter launch bays. Its primary weapons were said to be macro cannons that fired large fusion-charged shells that saturated an area in atomic blasts at short range. These bits of info helped me to narrow down the options of what kind of ship it could be. And during my research, I had to research what a macro cannon was, honestly, because in my mind I thought it was something like a Nova cannon, but in reality, macro cannons are just regular broadside weapon batteries. Space Marine vessels would have bombardment cannons instead of macro cannons for comparison. Also important to point out is that the Nighthag was not a Space Marine ship, but one that could be used by a rogue trader, which points to me and says that it's an Imperial Navy fleet ship. The Nighthag could go toe-to-toe with Imperial Navy ships because it was one as well, which helped narrow it down a bit. I did research on the kinds of macro cannons that existed in 40k and came upon a class of macro cannons called Disruption macro cannons, which had another variant called Disruption macro cannon broadsides. The key characteristic of Disruption macro cannons is that they fire a shell of highly charged ionized deuterium atoms, which cause minimal damage and are intended to overload and shut down power transfer systems throughout a target vessel. They are said to be particularly useful for vessels that need to be captured intact. This sounds very similar to what the Nighthag possessed, the kind of macro cannons that the Nighthag possessed. Another key detail about the Nighthag was that it contained an unusual drive system that created a disruptive effect with the potential to confuse enemy targeting scanners and protect the cruiser from direct weapons fire, which is pretty cool. So in looking out for what kind of ship the Nighthag could have been, key points for me to look out were Grand Cruiser with weapons batteries that were short-range macro cannons, multiple lances, and fighter launch bays. Using the Battlefleet Heresy Red Book, which is a compendium of ships used during the Horus Heresy, their rules and stats, I have come to the conclusion that the Nighthag is a Retaliator Grand Cruiser. The Retaliator Grand Cruiser is the only cruiser and ship in the entire book that fits the profile for the Nighthag. The Nighthag was deployed to attack Loyalist shipping during the Badab War, and it's said to have accounted for more kills and captured vessels than any other starship in the Successionist fleet. How? Its short-range weapons batteries were likely disruption macro-cannon broadsides that shut down targeting ships, allowing the executioners to board, slaughter, and capture. The fact that it was seized from a renegade rogue trader and had to be cleansed of chaos taint is no surprise, because Retaliator ships were heavily used by and are recognized as chaos ships, since trader forces frequently used Imperial Navy ships during the Horus Heresy. It was probably considered to be a cruiser of unknown class because the Imperium has largely discontinued their use, with only one Loyalist Retaliator being known to be in use, called the Monarch of Whispers. I just had to do that because this is a deep dive and I do love the chapter, and I just don't like when things are not known in the lore, and so I did a deep dive, and that's my conclusion. So yeah, moving on. Concerning the Executioner's chapter history now, they are currently on a penitent crusade, and they're earning their honors back. They're being witnessed by Imperial officers who are witnessing their battles. It is currently 80 years into their penitent crusade. It's supposed to be 100 years, so sooner or later they are going to emerge from the penitent crusade and return to Stygia Aquilon. Now, Stygia Aquilon was actually passed to the Salamanders chapter and their own successor chapters during the Badab War, or after the Badab War, because of their involvement on the wrong side of the battle. And so after their 100 years of penitent is over, they are able to go back to Stygia Aquilon if they survive as a chapter, because during a penitent crusade you're not allowed to recruit any new members. So if they survive this crusade for the next 20 years in the narrative, they are able to go back to Stygia Aquilon, and the Salamanders will give them their fortress monastery back. They will be able to recruit from the population once more. Now, concerning the Primaris Marines, I have a feeling that they will be one of those chapters that does not get gray shields, but instead is given the organs and the technology to implement the Primaris gene seed, just because of their history of being on the wrong side of a conflict that might interfere with them being able to get Primaris Marines. I personally feel like that's the better option. Make it a Rubicon procedure, make it something that is incorporated into the chapter from their own people, rather than adding gray shields to the chapter. Now, I know that there were certain characters in the Executioners that I did not mention, but this was not meant to be a 100% lore video. It was meant to be a deep dive on some of the information that was rather odd or not gone into to my liking. So there's a bunch of videos on the Executioners if you want to know about characters such as Thulsa Cain, who is the High Executioner Chaplain Death Speaker or Lord Speaker of the Dead, and a few others. But I think with that being said, I think the video is done. I hope that you all enjoyed this video. I hope that you learned something new from the Executioners, and I hope that it inspires you to create a force of Executioners. With that being said, Inquisitor Vaughn out. Remember, the Emperor protects and the future is successor.